So I'll get started. Once again, good morning, everybody. And I'll be delivering this session on academic publishing. Basically, after today's session, you'll basically get to know a lot about manuscript drafting. You'll get to know what's the IMRAD format. I'll share some tips on manuscript drafting. I'll also highlight some of the common errors that authors commit when they draft manuscripts. I would also be mentioning what reviewers like and what they dislike. And I'll give you some tips and guidelines so that you'll be able to publish successfully in your dream journal or your target journal. Uh, then finally, we'll also discuss a few aspects about how to avoid journal rejection. So there are a lot of very interesting takeaways for today. So with that, let me get started. Now, before I initiate the presentation, let me ask everyone one more time. Am I clearly audible and are my slides visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Nikan Bharan. So let's see what is scholarly communication. So what exactly is it and who needs it and why is it so important? Now, all of us, many of us have a PhD. Some of us might be pursuing a PhD. Some of us could be young principal investigators. There could be various scenarios, but all of us at some point in our academic career, we always need to take help of something called as scholarly communication. And if you own the right skills, you'll be able to communicate your science or you communicate your research to your target audience. And the way you communicate is through various platforms, through we a research facility that I have established at some university, I'll make a technical presentation mentioning, all the key aspects like what are the equipments, about what kind of instrumentation is available, so forth and so on. And then I'll highlight lots of technical details. So that's like a technical presentation. Just one example. There could be many other ways you present it. Today's webinar is also a form of scholarly communication because intellectual material is being exchanged and there's going to be a sharing of knowledge in a particular niche area. In this case, it's academic publishing. PhD thesis, all of us know it's a very well-known form of scholarly communication. So are conference talks, official correspondences. Like, for example, I'm sure some or all of you, or at least many of you, must have replied to journal referees. So those are all official correspondences. So these are all parts of scholarly communication. They all fall under scholarly communication. Um, so um, so now today's emphasis will not be on all of these topics. We are going to very specifically narrow down our attention and we'll be focusing on exclusively on the research articles because academic publishing is the training session. We'll be focusing on research articles. Now, when it comes to publishing, all of us know that we basically write research papers so that we can get more grants, we can contribute to the advancement of our field, and basically so forth and so on. There are various different missions and objectives, but there are a few things that are critical when it comes to academic publishing and grant writing. The very first thing that I really need to emphasize on is having a novel idea. If you have a novel idea, then definitely the chances of your work getting accepted by a uh, by a by a major journal or by your dream journal or by a good journal, by a decent journal, increase significantly. The same thing is true about grants. If you write a really wonderful grant application, the odds of it getting funded increase significantly. So if you have a well-written manuscript, it should get accepted in a decent journal. Ideally, it should get accepted in a dream journal, because all of us need to have that one dream journal in mind. I'm sure all of you have some kind of a journal in mind, depending on what your field is. But the way to go about is to have a novel idea, because unless and until you have a novel idea, none of the techniques are really going to work. So having a novel idea is at the core of academic publishing. And by academic publishing, what I mean to say is mainly research papers. But there's also a lot of importance that is given to grant writing, and because that is what funds your research. That is how you produce research articles, because unless and until you have the money to do your experiments, you will not be able to publish. So academic publishing and grant writing, these are both really interconnected. Now let's focus on academic publishing. How to go about writing a good manuscript? What are the elements? What are the key elements of a successful journal manuscript? How can you increase your chances of getting accepted? How can you increase the odds of getting your work published in a decent journal? So we'll see that in a bit. Now, first of all, let me ask you a question. In the last 1 year or in the last few years, have you come across an interesting problem? Have you come across an interesting topic, a hot topic, or a burning question? So everybody who has, just type yes in the chat box. Just type yes in the chat box. All right, wonderful. So now let me highlight one more thing here. Merely having a novel idea in mind, or merely having an interesting problem or a hot topic, does not really help. You also need to know what other people have done so far. So what is known so far, what has been published? Is there any research gap? Is there something that's missing? Why is it missing? Why did nobody think about it? And it's kind of good that nobody thought of it, because that's exactly how you get a chance to contribute. Because if somebody else has already thought about it, then your chances of getting your work published based on that missing thing, missing link, will be significantly lesser. So in nature, it's always like that. Processes occur and there are always gaps. So this is also a process, and any process is not fully efficient, 100% efficient. There are always some errors, gaps, and that need to be addressed. The same thing is true even in academic publishing. We publish a lot of papers, even our peers publish a lot of papers, but there are always going to be some research gaps. It's next to impossible to find a research field that has no research gaps. That's not possible, because that's exactly the basic premise of research, that it's a constantly evolving area. Whatever great thing you do today may not be relevant tomorrow. So there will always be always be a research gap. Filling that research gap is your job as a researcher. Identifying and filling that research gap is what you have to do, and is what you have to keep in mind. So you have to do a meticulous literature survey. This is what I keep telling all the people. Before you identify an interesting problem, just make sure you have done enough homework. Just make sure you have undertaken a meticulous research survey. Now, your idea needs to be novel. How will you contribute to the field? If it is a very kind of a not so novel idea, like I have shared this joke many times during my presentation. Like somebody once came to my office and asked me if a particular research topic was important. So I asked them what was the topic. So the person told me it's about the emotional stability of bank employees from the north part of a particular state. I said, why is that important? Why do you think that is an important article? the person waited for a few seconds and said, oh yeah, stand the mistake should be. He changed the, I don't remember if it was a he or she, but the person changed the title to emotional stability of male employees from the northern part of a particular state. I said, oh yeah, that's slightly more specific. Congratulations. But do you think it's a novel idea? Okay, then the researcher hesitated again. And then after 2-3 minutes, the person came up with a final title. The final title being as follows: Emotional Stability of Male and Female Employees from the North and Southwest region of a particular state. I said, wow, that's a lot of hard work, a lot of details, but do you think it is still a novel idea? So the whole point of sharing this with you is that whenever you decide to pursue a particular topic of research, you have to really see whether it is going to be of any help to society or industry. I mean, emotional stability, all those things sound great, and I'm sure people have worked on that. That's a great thing to pursue, but whether it is going to do any significant value addition to your field is what you have to decide. Now, I'm not saying that it's a bad topic, or I'm not going to judge the topic or anything. It could be a good topic perhaps, but you have to seek for something much higher than that and much more exceptional, something that will massively affect your field or society or industry, something really outstanding. That should be your aim. If you aim for that, if you aim for something very high, then at least you will be able to come up with at least a tiny little novel idea. But it has to be novel. It cannot be silly. It cannot be laughable. It should not be funny. It can be funny, but for a movie probably, not for academic publishing. It has to be novel. All right. So how are you going to differentiate your work from something that is already out there? It has to be very unique and genuine. It cannot just be a replication or duplication of somebody's work. So that's why it's a novel idea. It is unique, it is genuine, it is different, and it contributes immensely to your field. It may contribute immensely, it may contribute slightly, it may contribute moderately, but it has to be contribute. It has to contribute. Ideally, it has to contribute massively, but at least, if not massively, at least moderately or to some extent. But it has to be novel. That's the key message here. Now, the second point is, do you have the adequate training and availability of good resources? This is very important because you can always dream of publishing in a great journal, but if you don't have the right training and the right resources, how are you going to achieve that task? That's difficult, right? So you have to first ensure that you have the right equipment and the right training. Once you have that confidence, you will be able to say that, yes, I'm ready to work on this research topic. I have done good literature survey. I have come up with a novel idea. This is the burning problem that I'm going to address. This is the research gap that I've identified. I have the right training. I have the right resources. And come on, let's get started. I'll enter the race and I'll start working on my research project, which I eventually plan to publish in a decent academic journal. Now, manuscript types. This is a very common question that many people ask me. Now, where should I publish my article? Should it be like a full length article, or should it be a short communication, like a rapid or short communication, a letter, or should it be a review article? Like, tell me. Now, let's first of all differentiate between the two. Everybody knows what's a review article, so I don't need to emphasize on that. We also know what's a research article. But there's a difference between a full length article and a rapid communication. A full length article basically addresses an interesting problem. Yes, the problem is interesting, no doubt. But if it's a rapid or short communication or a letter, it means that there is a high chance that it's a landmark study. It's an exceptional research project, the implications of which are going to be profound. So usually these types of manuscripts get published, as short full-length articles, and they address a very burning question, a massively burning question, a hot topic. And many of these papers you'll see in like reputed journals. They get published as letters or rapid short communications. So you should ideally aim for these, your contribution should be so immense that it should get published as a rapid communication. But if not, at least let's focus on full-length research articles first. Target journal. Now this is very critical. How do I select a journal? Should it be any journal or should it be a dream journal? This is a very critical question. Now you can always publish in some journal. Nobody in the world can stop publishing this, you know. Tell you an interesting story. Um, Somebody came to my office and just said, asked me if it is okay to publish in some XYZ journal. And I said, what's the review process? They said, you know, they yesterday I submitted it. And said, oh, so you have already. So I said, oh, so you have already submitted? Yeah, yeah. So he said, yeah, I already submitted yesterday morning. And you know, I'm pleased to, sir, I'm pleased to let you know that I submitted yesterday morning. They did peer review in the afternoon, and by evening my great research work got accepted in the journal. I said, congratulations, but you submitted to the wrong journal. It's a predatory journal. You definitely don't want to get your work published in a predatory journal, because those are not the kind of journals that lead to the advancement of any field at all. So you have to select a very good journal. Ideally, it should be a dream journal, but at least if not, it should be a decent journal, definitely not a predatory journal. Okay, now I'm at slide number 8. Let me ask one more time if my audio is clear and my slides are visible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is clear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Nikat madam. So let's continue. Slide number 9. Target option. How do I select a target journal? There are so many journals out there, thousands and thousands of journals. I am getting really confused. I don't know where to start. Now I'll give you some very easy guidelines based on which you can actually select your target journal. Now there are always three kinds of journals. There is this dream journal. You can see the beautiful image at the bottom corner, right hand side. Then there are journal with good, and then journal. Now, in the first case, if it's a good journal, I mean, not a good, a decent journal, not a really fantastic journal, but a decent journal. It has a faster review. It has a higher acceptance rate, but you will get fewer citations, and it will not create a huge impact on the field. Now, moving on to the next category, if it's a journal that has good metrics, then it is slightly or much better than the above, meaning the review could be a little bit slower, the acceptance rate might be lower, but you will get slightly more number of citations, and the impact of your research will also be more or significantly more, depending on how good it is. And in the case of the dream journal, dream journals have a very slow review process, very ultra low acceptance rate. Some journals reject almost 90% of the papers that are submitted to their editorial office. Journals like Cell, Science, Nature, you know, there are so many. But once you publish there, you end up getting plenty and plenty of citations, and you massively impact your field, you know. So you have to decide where to publish and how to take this decision. Now this decision is not an easy decision. It's based on several criteria. You have to be experienced in this area in order to take the right decision where to publish. Now, one thing for sure that you should never do is to publish in a borderline journal that has barely been indexed like last month or last year in Scopus database. Like for example, now don't go by the number that I'm saying. The numbers may vary, but for example, if somebody says that I'm going to publish in a journal that has an H index of 5, I'll say that's a risky investment, because you're investing your time in such a great research project, and then you are publishing in a journal that has an H index of 5 or 2. That's not a really good idea. You're taking a huge risk, because what if tomorrow Scopus or Clarivate Analytics decides to kick out the journal from its database? Then after you're done with your PhD and you put the journal, the publication on your CV, you go for an interview, nobody will know where you have published, because they'll not be able to see the journal in the Scopus database. They'll think that you have published in some weird journal and they'll not take you seriously. So that's why I tell people that no matter what happens, never, first of all, first rule, never publish in predatory journals. And a few slides later, I'll tell you how to identify a predatory journal. That is one thing. But also let me address the gray area. The gray area where it is neither right nor wrong. But you cannot just lead life by doing the right or the wrong. You should also do a few wise things. Now, what is wisdom? Wisdom is something you gain from experience. So you cannot just say that this is right and that is wrong. You have to do the right things, definitely, but you also have to do the wise things. So that's why I'm trying to address this gray area. If you tell me that yes, the journal has an H index, yes, the journal is Scopus index, but yeah, what is the H index? It's like 2. No, don't publish there. Publish in decent journals, good journals. Target for a dream journal. All right. So what are the different journal metrics? Now, everybody knows what is the Hirsch index, H index. If I say that the H index of a journal is 100, what it means is that the journal has at least 100 publications, each with at least 100 citations. The journal has 100 publications, each with at least 100 citations. There could be more. At least 100 means it could be 150, 200, 250, whatever. But there are at least 100 publications in that journal, each of which have at least 100 citations. So then the H index is 100. So if it is 2, it just means that the journal has 2 publications, and each of these 2 publications has at least 2 citations. So then that's a low H index. 100 is like a decent or kind of a good H index, and 500 is fantastic. All right. Now, Shimago journal ranking. This is something that you can access very easily. You don't have to pay a penny. If you go to the Shimago website, you can cross-check the journal ranking of any journal. All decent Scopus index journals are listed here. Then if you want to pay and access, then there is something called as Clarivate Analytics Impact Factor. Now you'll be surprised that you don't really have to waste your money on Clarivate Analytics Impact Factor. If you just go for the Shimago journal ranking, many or most of the journals, at least many that are listed by Thomson Reuters, that company keeps changing the name. It used to be called Thomson Reuters, then now it's Clarivate Analytics. The name keeps changing all the time. But basically, that is one business that shares impact factors for a fee, whereas the European counterpart, Shimago journal ranking, the company or the organization that publishes this ranking, they give it free of cost. So you can just go to Shimago website and access that. Higher the better. Higher the better. SJR higher the better. H index higher the better. Journal scope. Now, merely knowing the journal reputation doesn't help. You also need to know what is the scope of the journal. So let's say you're an engineer. You want to publish your work in the Journal of Computer Engineering, but accidentally you submit it to the Journal of Electrical Engineering or to the Journal of Biological Chemistry. It will get instantly rejected. Why? Because you did your entire research in computer engineering and you submitted to the Journal of Biological Chemistry. How is it going to be accepted? It will get rejected in less than 1 second. The editor will just see the title and click the reject button. So the journal scope is very important. Now I give a very drastic example, but sometimes what happens is, let's say you're working in the area of cell biology. The cell biology is very closely related to biological chemistry, but still, if you submit to the wrong journal, it's outside the scope of the journal, the editor within seconds will reject your manuscript. So you have to very carefully see. You have to literally read the mission and aim and mission of the journal, and then you have to decide accordingly. Now, you have to identify journals based on the journal reputation, journal scope, and also you use journal tools, Elsevier and Springer. if you just Google for journal selection tool online, you'll come across tools like this. So what you have to do is you just have to paste your abstract in the text box, and based on those keywords, that software recommends a list of journals. But use these journal selection tools with caution, because they will only suggest a few journals that are being published by them. Like for example, if you use Elsevier's tool, it will only suggest the journals being published by Elsevier. If you use the Springer's journal selection tool, it will never suggest any journals published by Elsevier. It will only suggest Springer journals, right? And then also the other problem is you get restricted to only a few journals. Whereas if you search by journal reputation, journal scope, and many of these things, journal metrics, you have a much wider choice. Lastly, and this is very important, this is a very important point, you have to read some of the recently published articles from your journal of interest. Let's say I am working in the area of biochemistry and molecular biology. Then I have to go and talk to people. I have to see what are the most commonly read and cited journals in my field. Then that's the first step. Second step is I have to actually go and read some of the recent articles published in these journals, and then see what kind of research is going on, what is the mission objective, what is the general ethos, what is the essence, what things are being highlighted. Once you get a fair idea, and this thing you can grasp only when you do a lot of reading. That's why I keep people telling, I keep telling people that you have to constantly upgrade and update yourself. You have to constantly keep reading. Literature review is not something which you do once in a lifetime, only for your PhD, or only when you're writing the introduction section, or when you're writing the review article. You have to, this is a continuous process. You have to constantly keep looking for new things. Many people, what they do, what my boss used to do when I was working as a PhD student at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the United States. It's a very reputed university. My boss had set a alert. My boss had set an alert. So whenever a new publication used to come out, he had set up an alert using some keywords, and he used to get notified by email, and then he used to go and check that publication. So I would also recommend all of you to do this. You can set up alerts. There are various ways of doing it. If you don't want to set an alert, that's also fine. You can just go to PubMed, you can go to IEEE, you can go to so many of these fantastic repositories and databases, and try to access the journal of your interest. All right, so now let's discuss what are predatory journals. And I'm sure many of you must be knowing there was a person by the name Jeffrey B. All. His name was Jeffrey B. All, and he had made a list of the criteria that can be used to red flag a journal and identify it as a predatory journal. So what are some of the red flags? First of all, rapid acceptance. Just like I mentioned in my joke, a person submits a manuscript at 9 o'clock. It gets reviewed by 12 noon and gets accepted by 4 o'clock. That's definitely a horrible journal. It's a predatory journal, because the peer review process doesn't even exist. Probably the editor is sitting with a toothbrush in his mouth, his or her mouth, and then looking at the computer and saying, oh, some more money is coming in my bank account, somebody is ready to pay 500 rupees, come on, let's quickly review the journal manuscript, let's quickly accept it. And what they do is, they're very clever people. You know what they do? They just say, oh, they just fake the review process. You know how they do it? They just review your manuscript and say, oh wow, fantastic article, however, can you make the introduction little broader, can you make the discussions session little bit narrower, and there are some spelling mistakes, can you do some corrections? Oh, and otherwise everything is fine, we are accepting your manuscript. So I also feel happy. Oh my god, somebody actually reviewed my manuscript and I'm so happy and it is getting accepted. But that is all fake. This is fake satisfaction. You may get overjoyed when it's get rapidly accepted, and but that's not what you should do, because it does not in any way contribute to the advancement of the field. It's a waste of time. Many journals, they have fictitious journal editors. You'll laugh when I tell you that there is a famous company in Hyderabad. What it does is it organizes fake conferences. Now, just like predatory journals, there are predatory conferences as well. I'll not name it because that's a very almost like a criminal kind of a organization, and they go behind people who try to identify them with their lawyers. So I don't want to get involved in a court case, so I'm not going to name them. If you want to know their name, just call me. I'll tell you over the phone. Don't record my phone call. All right. So many of these people, what they do is they organize fake conferences. Now, what is a fake conference? A fake conference, people who are not real experts, sometimes even students, they are invited as top speakers for fake conferences. And the conference is not even related to a particular, is not even allied to a particular area. It's like too random, too general, and nobody has any idea what's going on. And the person who gets invited gets to put it on his or her CV that he was invited as a speaker. But none of that helps because the people who are listening also don't understand what's going on. Everybody gets a certificate, and all those things happen, but it's of no use. So that's a predatory conference. It's not a good conference. So how do you know, how do you identify these things? Well, look at the speakers, look at their achievements, what they have done. All of those things tell you a lot. Many of the, coming back to predatory journals, they use fake metrics. Many of the journals will say, oh, we have a global impact factor of 14.3. Now tell me, what's a global impact factor? I have no idea. Some of them say, oh, we have a New Delhi impact factor of 36. What's a New Delhi impact factor? I don't care, because that's silly. That there's no such thing as a New Delhi impact factor. So you have to be careful with these people. They have fake metrics. If somebody says the impact factor is 39, ask the person, what impact factor? Which impact factor? Is it Clarivate Analytics impact factor? Is it Samago journal ranking? Because these are the only two metrics that are extremely well established. Clarivate Analytics impact factor, or it used to be called as Thomson Reuters impact factor, or Samago journal ranking. Outside of these two, it's all funny world. There could be some new things coming up, but mostly funny. Then there are some bizarre and meaningless articles published in these predatory journals. Let me share you one more interesting thing. Computer science, there were some computer science experts, and I'm sure many of you could be computer science, computer engineers, software experts. So what they did is they used a software to automatically generate a paper, and it made no sense at all. It was a very funny paper, and they submitted it to a journal which they thought was predatory, and the journal actually accepted that article. Even today, I think it is there. So if you go and check it, the article does not make any sense. The title is wrong. The abstract is horrible. The article doesn't even make sense, yet it was reviewed by 3 referees and accepted. It even had referee comments. You'll be surprised. Yes. So you have to be really careful. Now, there are too many questionable practices, and I'm sure you get my point by now. I don't have to overemphasize. Now, very important tip, don't ever pay to get access to a list of predatory journals. Somebody told me that they had to spend hundreds or probably thousands of dollars to get access to a blacklist of journals. It's not required. See, it's a very simple thing. If a journal is not listed on Clarivate Analytics Impact Factor, it does not have a Clarivate Analytics Impact Factor, it does not have an SJR, the odds of it being a questionable journal increase very, very, very significantly. So just use elimination. यहाँ पे नहीं है. If it's not there, it means there is a chance that it's predatory. I'm not saying that it is predatory, but excuse me, but the chance of it being a predatory journal increase significantly. Okay, now let's quickly revise what we saw till now. We basically saw why literature review is important. Then we saw, we talked about identification of a good research problem or a hot topic or a burning question. we talked about literature review, and I also mentioned why it should be an ongoing activity. Okay, by the way, let me mention one more reason why literature review should be a continuous process. What happened is one of my colleagues, she was working on a research project when I was working in Chicago, United States. She was working on a research project. She was my senior. She was like 2 3 years senior to me. And what happened is one fine day, she logged into her computer. She went to PubMed, and on the National Library of Medicine website, she saw that somebody on that unfortunate morning, well, fortunate or unfortunate morning, depending on who is looking at that article, somebody published a research article that was exactly focusing on what she was focusing. So then, because she read that article, she immediately stopped working on that area, and she kind of changed her research project. And this is one reason why you should constantly do research literature review, because if you spend 6 to 8 months or 1 year doing something only to realize that somebody has already published it like 1 month ago, it's a waste of time. That's why you have to constantly keep reading, and that's why you have to do your work diligently, so that if you do your work diligently, you could be the first to publish. Because in science or in research, there is no place for the second person. You have to be the first person. You have to be the first to show that something happened. I mean, you can be the second or third, but then your impact goes on decreasing. I'm not saying that you should never be the second. You can be second, third, fourth. Don't be the 500th person. Be in the top few, top 10 or whatever, something on those lines. So I'm sure you get my point. uh, so now systematic planning of experiments is required. You have to hire the right kind of positive controls, negative controls. You have to plan the, see why Japan is such a fantastic country, because they spend a lot of time in planning, a lot of time in planning, and they implement it quickly and smoothly. That's the Japanese style of working, and that's what I like really. You have to spend a lot of time on planning. I mean, don't spend like 100 years, because nobody even lives for 100 years, but spend a decent amount of time troubleshooting, planning, discussing, without divulging too much details, because then somebody else may steal your idea. You have to be careful. But also you have to spend enough time in discussing, then plan your experiments, and then implement, do the implementation. Select one or more target journals, and then you have to keep modifying the. Now what happens is, sometimes what happens, you plan your experiment, you do literature review, you identify the burning question, you start working, and then suddenly after 1 or 2 months you realize, oh my god, what if I change my direction and go in the other direction? It will have a much higher impact. Why not go for it? Go for it. You should always be flexible. As researchers, we have to have an open mindset. We have to be open to change. Change is something that is a universal constant. You cannot resist change. Anybody who resists change cannot be a good researcher. So feel free to modify your research topic at any time. And just like I said, just like predatory journals, you should also avoid borderline journals, and we already saw why. All right, so let's discuss a brand new topic now: reference managers. I'm sure many of you have used EndNote or Mendeley Desktop. Um if you go to YouTube, and if you just type Mendeley Desktop, I had made a video a few years ago on my channel Vidunium, and on that you'll be able to see this video, how to use Mendeley Desktop. It has got lots of thousands and thousands of views. Um, okay, so you can check it online. Now, first of all, never ever type your references manually. We are not here for typing. We are here for doing meaningful research. We are here to educate people. We are here to make people grow smarter every day. Typing is not what we are paid for. So never ever type your references manually. That's one very common mistake that I see people doing all the time. Let's say you have 150 references for your thesis, or 50 references for your research article. Why would you spend time in typing when you can easily insert them using a reference manager? And that's why you should use reference manager. They save your time, and you can spend that time meaningfully on other much more interesting activities. So these are two examples: Mendeley Desktop, EndNote. There could also be more, Zotero, and there are so many. Um, Now you have to review your journal's guidelines to know more about the to know more about the citation style. There are so many citation styles. See, when it comes to citation style, there's no such thing as right or wrong. It's a matter of choice. And here, who does the choice? It's not you. It's the journal. So if the journal says use IEEE style, IEEE citation style, go for it. If they want APA, go for it. If they want MLA, go for it. If they want Chicago, go for it. Accordingly, you have to change the settings in your Mendeley desktop software or EndNote software so that every time you look up for a reference, it gets automatically inserted in your manuscript in the exact style. Okay. Now, you should start inserting references as soon as you start writing your manuscript. It's a very common mistake and it's a very bad idea to insert your references at the end of your drafting process. Because what happens is you may in fact accidentally forget to add a few references. Many of these things can happen, so you never do that. And also it decreases the efficiency. So you get bored if you have to sit and enter 150 references, and when you get bored your efficiency decreases, and that's why it's not it's kind of detrimental to the overall process. So what I say to people is, when you are in that particular flow, you're writing a particular piece in your manuscript, you know that what are the logical steps and how to go about. So that's the right time to keep adding your references. So add it and forget it, add it and forget it. That's how you do it. So that's more efficient than sitting one day and spending 4 days and 5 days and just inserting references. Sometimes people do it in like 6 hours. They just add some random references. Now I have like 50 references. Oh, I feel so satisfied. Let me have lunch. No, that's not the right way to do it. You have to keep on adding your references as you go. Now, double check to make sure you include all the key references. This is one mistake. When I was working as the associate director at a private university in Gujarat, I used to see this many times. People, just because they started their work for 4 years ago, all the references in their thesis are from 8 years ago. Don't do that. You have to always have recent references. You have to keep updating, and till the day you draft your article or your thesis, whatever are the most current and relevant articles, I'm not saying it should be exactly from that day, but you get my point, right? It should be fairly recent. Just don't keep citing all the very super old references, because see, what the reviewers do is they see if your work is relevant and if it is current. And one of the ways of showing that is to cite current references. And don't do it artificially, just for the sake of it. Do it genuinely. Do it genuinely. Okay, one more thing, very important. Avoid citing yourself. This is a very bad practice that many people follow. You should never cite yourself. Cite only if it is really, 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 really necessary. Otherwise, don't do that. A while ago, I think Times Higher Education, they published a list of the top universities in the world. When they did that, they accounted for citations, and in the process, they actually excluded self citations. So if you cite yourself anyway, you're going to be, those citations are going to be excluded at some point. So why include at all? Don't include. Don't cite yourself. Let others cite you. Don't say that you are great. Let others say that you are great. And how does that happen? When others cite you. If you go to Google Scholar and try to look up who has cited you, you'll immediately know who has cited you. That's your achievement. That's when you start feeling, you start getting a sense of achievement and accomplishment. You have a purpose in life, you have meaning in life, because you are contributing to the advancement of your field. it's a great feeling. So go to Google Scholar and check today who is citing you. If people are citing you, great. If not, start working on a really great research topics that you start getting some noteworthy references, citations, I mean. Now, very rarely will you see images of police officers and handcuffs in a or in a presentation on academic publishing. But I have intentionally put them because nobody will tell this to you, or very few people will tell this to you. But in fact, a researcher in South Korea got arrested. The person was sent to jail. He was sent to jail for fabricating data. He published his article in the very reputed journal Science, and people came to know that it was based on fake data. Just like Donald Trump keeps sharing fake news all the time, uh, wrong information. Donald Trump does it all the time. I openly tell this to people. Everybody knows it. I don't have to tell. Similarly, this researcher from South Korea fabricated all the data and published it, managed to somehow publish it in a great journal, Science. And I think it was Science, yeah. And then he got arrested. So do not plagiarize. Do not plan your results. If you plan your results, are they really results? No, it is fabrication. If you already know the results, even before starting the experiment, that is not a good thing. Many times I see principal investigators telling their PhD students, so this is what we have to show. No, this is what we cannot show anything. We have to only see. We have to only see and then base our conclusions on what we saw, not not on what we want to see. That's the difference. Don't plan your results. Do not plagiarize. See, let me tell you something about plagiarism. Where does most of the plagiarism occur? It occurs in the introduction section of your manuscript because that's the review. All the time. Don't do that. Don't do that. See, never read when you are writing and never write when you are reading. If you follow this thumb rule, you will never end up plagiarizing. It is perfectly okay to read research articles. It is perfectly legitimate to do literature review. Excuse me. Try to analyze, try to grasp what the person is trying to say or what the research group that has published the article is trying to say. Put it in your own words and then communicate it to your target audience in your own language. And then without fail, cite the article. That is okay. But merely control seeing and control viewing, and even if you include the citation, still copy and paste is not a good practice. It is still plagiarism. So even tiny chunk or medium chunk, whatever size of the chunk is, you still cannot copy and paste. And this is only okay. Here's a quick warning. Huh? This is only about the literature review section. If you try to do it with the result section, that's a big no. Even if you try to understand and try to explain it in your own words, no, you cannot do that. That is a massive issue. That's a massive data fabrication. Don't do that. I'm sure none of us do that, but it is my duty to moral responsibility to communicate this to you. Never digitally manipulate images or fabricate numbers. I'll share something very interesting with you. Many journals these days, when they doubt that a person has fabricated data, they ask for the raw data. And there are very sophisticated tools that can easily red flag your Excel sheet and say that it is a fabricated Excel sheet based on some very popular statistical rules. Like, for example, how often does the number 7 occur? How often does the number 8 occur? So they actually make plots, and then if they see a regular pattern, they say that, yeah, it's a normal data generated by the machine naturally. But if you fabricate the data using some sophisticated tools, they can actually check your raw data, cross check it and say that, this is data fabrication, caught you. And they'll reject your manuscript. Not just that, they will red flag you and they'll blacklist you for your entire life. So you'll never be able to publish their entire range of journals. Like if you get blacklisted by Elsevier, if you get blacklisted by Springer, you will never be able to publish in any of their journals, even if the H index is moderate or whatever. So be very careful. Never fabricate numbers. Never digitally manipulate images using Adobe Photoshop. Many people, especially in life sciences, they do this all the time. They suddenly take off a chunk of some material from here and then no, don't do that, because nowadays it's very easy. They actually outsource this work to some companies, and there are very smart graphic designers and professionals and industry experts who can actually find out if an image is original, was it whether it was obtained from a confocal microscope or was it obtained from Adobe Photoshop. So a while ago a researcher got caught. The person actually downloaded images of antibodies, Western blots, not antibodies, Western blots from Google Images, and they made some changes. यहाँ वहाँ थोड़ा brightness, contrast, they inverted it by 180 degrees and then published it. And then, but it did not get published during the peer review process. It got red flagged, and somehow the reviewers thought that something was not right. So they outsourced it to an agency, and the agency caught the person. And the person was blacklisted by Elsevier or Springer. I don't remember which publisher, but yeah, the person got blacklisted. Now, do not practice salami slicing. What is salami slicing? When you know that your research work can be published as a single manuscript, instead, if you split it into 2 or 3 or 4 pieces and publish it at 4 different places in the same journal or in 4 different journals, that is salami slicing. That's unethical. Because what happens is it creates hurdles. If I want to access your work, I have to go to 4 different places and access your work. So that's not an ethical practice. That's not a good academic practice. So never do salami slicing. It may artificially increase your citations, but that's a very unfair practice. And it is unfair because of the reason I mentioned. It just causes massive inconvenience to the people from my field. And also that's not the right. It also, that's one reason. And number 2 reason, it does not give me a holistic picture of the entire research project. That's why if you know that something falls under one roof, you have to publish it as a single paper in a single journal and not split it up into pieces. So never practice salami slicing. Now you should get the required, whatever is the compulsory lab safety training. Like, why is this important? There was a researcher from South Korea, and what happened is, it could be from any country. It doesn't have to be South Korea. Tomorrow it could be from China, and you have to be very careful if you're dealing with people from certain nationalities. Why this entire coronavirus thing happened? I'm not saying that I have definite proof with me, but there's a fair chance that it happened because of some safety issues, lab safety issues in the Wuhan Institute of Virology based in China. I'm not saying that happened. I'm not at all saying, but this is what might have happened. And many people are saying that it might have happened. There's no, in fact, there are some publications saying that it was not a virus that was engineered, but still it could be, there could be a fair chance that a natural strain was leaked from the lab, whether it was leaked artificially or it was leaked naturally, or whether it did not take place there. Nobody knows. It might have happened in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It might not have happened. Nobody knows. But there's a high degree of chance that it actually happened there. Why? Why am I saying this? Because the people working actually not following the right lab safety protocols. People were handling very deadly samples. They were handling bats even without wearing gloves, and the photos were published online. And that's why many people tend to believe that that probably was the source. But that's kind of a political issue, so let's leave that aside for now. But the point here is the take-home message is that you have to follow lab safety protocols. Otherwise, you may end up harming society, and that's what we don't want to do. So coming back to the point, there was a one researcher, I forgot whether he was from South Korea or China, probably from China, I don't remember. And what he did is one night he came active, and he did not tell anyone. Next day, people came and they started doing the experiment. Suddenly, in one corner, this when they took that machine that detects radiation levels, they saw a huge increase in the beeps. So beep, 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 beep. So it means there was a clear spill, and people are shocked. Like, how come the reading is so high? What happened? So immediately, the person who saw this immediately called the lab safety office of our university. The people came in wearing masks and they completely sealed off the area, and a lot of things happened. Then they went and checked the security camera and they saw that some person came in inside the university premises in the lab at 12 o'clock, and clearly when they interviewed the person, the person admitted that he had spilled the radioactive vial, sample of the radioactive vial, and I mean the radioactive sample, and so that's how it happened. So but he could have ended up hurting a lot of people. People could have got cancer because of him. So that's why you have to follow the right lab safety training, and not just ignore it because you don't have the time. You have to invest some time in this really meaningful activity. Now you have to get also the required ethics committee approvals, especially now. I'm not sure how many of you are working with humans or animals. uh, is anybody doing clinical trials? If you are, then you have to first of all get approval from the ethics committee and then start your research project. And you have to be honest and diligent at all times. If you see some strange result, admit it, don't just ignore it. And you have to diligently think why you got that result instead of ignoring it, because you cannot just go and selectively focus on the results that serve your purpose. You have to get a holistic picture. And see, there's one more reason why this is important. Once a very famous person went to a conference, he presented his paper. Then somebody asked a question, and it is very important to ask questions, and it is very important to be able to participate in an intellectual meeting where people ask smart questions. Because if you are not able to answer a particular question, great, that is a great opportunity, because it probably may give rise to a new research problem which you can work on. So that's a win-win situation. So I always tell people, discuss actively your research, because that's how you may get a new idea. You can always acknowledge the person, yeah, because of tumhari wajah se I got this great idea. Nobody is suddenly going to give the Nobel Prize to that person. See, people don't get ideas, don't get Nobel Prizes for sharing ideas. People get Nobel Prizes for implementing the idea. Anybody can share an idea. I can share an idea, and 20 people can work on that idea. I'll never get the Nobel Prize. The people who actually work on. So that's okay. See, you have to keep sharing ideas and things. I'm not saying go and steal other people's idea. But if somebody asks you a question, and because somebody asked you a question, you suddenly get an idea because the person did not share an idea. The person shared a question, but you got the idea came to your mind. It is your invention. It is your discovery, invention actually, or perhaps discovery, depending on whether it was dormant or it was completely new. So that's the importance of meaningful asking meaningful questions. All right, so the race begins. Now let's actually focus on the various sections of a manuscript. Now, what's the IMRAD format? So IMRAD, what does it stand for? It is basically introduction, or I, M for materials and methods, and results and discussion is like R, the small a is for and. So results and discussion. IMRAD, introduction, materials and methods, results and discussion. So in the introduction section, you basically address the question why. Why are you pursuing this research topic? In the materials and methods section, you tell people how you are pursuing it. What kind of reagents did you purchase? What kind of methods are you using? In the results section, you tell people what results you got, what data did you end up generating? I mean, legitimately, what data did you what results did you get? And in the discussion section, you answer the very important question, so what? You obtained results, you used a particular methodology, you worked on a research problem after doing literature survey, you obtained the results, but so what? What difference does it make to society or industry? How does it contribute to the advancement of a field? So the question, so what, has to be answered. And ideally, now you can address this in a way in the conclusion section as well. Now, many times the last paragraph of the discussion section is the conclusion section. So that's why I put so what here. But if it is separate, then you can focus on the so what except in the actual conclusion section. But in some cases, or in many cases, the last paragraph of the discussion is actually the conclusion, and that's where you tell people how your work advances the field. Although you don't say it towards the beginning of the discussion section, in the discussion section you basically discuss your results, analyze your results, and towards the end, when you're about to conclude, you answer the question, so what? And sometimes you do it separately in a separate conclusion. So I'm sure you are getting my point. Now let's go get down to the nitty-gritties, the materials and methods section. Now I hope we don't run out of time because I have a lot of things to present. But I'm glad I'm at the 16th slide, so we'll finish in time. And I'll also give you 10-15 minutes, ideally 15 minutes, so that I can answer your questions. So it's 10:18 now. We'll finish by 10:45 or around 10:50 because I think we started 5-10 minutes late. So please bear with me if I extend a little bit after 11 o'clock, so that I want to make sure I get enough time to work on to present the material, and I also give enough time for you to ask me questions, because it's like a two-way process. It's not like one-way delivery. You also should get a chance to ask questions. You can ask them towards the end. All right. So materials and methods. Now check your target journal's author guidelines. This is what I keep telling people all the time. If you draft your manuscript without even checking the author guidelines, it's a massive waste of time, because you have to reformat your entire manuscript according so that it is in compliance with the journal guidelines. So why waste time? पहले से ही you read the journal's author guidelines so that you know what exactly are the expectations, so that once you know that you are in perfect compliance with the journal requirements, the odds of your work getting rejected are significantly low. Having said that, mere compliance with author guidelines cannot guarantee publication. This is one thing I keep telling people all the time. Because you nicely formatted your manuscript and it is looking great, it is exactly according to author guidelines, does not mean it is going to get accepted. It just means that the odds of it getting rejected have decreased significantly, but does not mean that it's going to be accepted. For it to be accepted, there are many other criteria, and we'll see those one by one. I'll share some tips with you. I'll also highlight some common errors. Use subheadings for different methodologies. There are things that are obvious. I'm not going to elaborate. You can quickly refer to them. Use the past tense, use standard nomenclature, describe new methods with sufficient detail. Why is this important? Because the whole point of having a materials and methods section in your manuscript is to make your work more reproducible. Other people should be able to reproduce your work. If they are not able to understand your methods, if they don't know the source from where you purchased your reagents, how are they going to reproduce your work? That's not possible, right? So that's why you have to ensure reproducibility, and that's why you have to describe your newer methods with sufficient detail. If it's a previous method, that's you can discuss it in brief and then point at a previous research paper. Whoever wants can go and refer to the elaborate method discussed in that paper. It will give them all the experimental details. But you don't have to, so that's why you don't have to describe it in detail if it's an established method. But if it's a new method, you have to share it with sufficient detail. Now, regardless of whether it is old or new, you have to write this section with great clarity and simplicity so that everybody understands. Now, you have to present all the appropriate control experiments, positive control, negative control. You have to mention all the statistical tests, like what test do you do? Students t-test, what are statistical tests, and then what parameters you used in your study. Now, one of the most common errors that I see authors doing is that they include the results and discussion in this section. Never ever do this. Materials and methods, just stick to materials and methods. That's it, nothing else. Okay, next section, figures and tables. Okay, now did you realize I am going in a particular order? Okay, I forgot to mention this, but let me mention it now. I am going in a particular order. Slide number 17 says materials and methods. Why is it my first slide? As soon as I discuss IMRAD, why did I immediately start with materials and methods? Because a lot of experts tend to believe, and many of the sources that I have referred to, and I'll also share the sources towards the end. Everybody says that you have to start writing a manuscript by starting with the materials and methods section, because that's the easiest section to write. It's like an icebreaker. It's like an appetizer. You can do it very easily. Nothing much is required. Just quickly finish it off. Then go to the slightly more difficult part, figures and tables. And why do you need to get your figures and tables ready? Because you can start working on your results only when you know what your figures are looking like and what your tables are trying to suggest. That's why immediately after the materials and methods section, start working on your figures and tables. All figures, table legends must be self-explanatory. If somebody looks at your figure, the person should immediately understand what you're trying to say, even without looking at the corresponding text. And this is very important. Let me emphasize this again. When a person looks at your image, your illustration, your diagram, your chart, your graph, your table, all of these should be self-explanatory. People shouldn't, I don't have to go back and forth to see what's said in table 1 and then what's said in the text. Again, come back to the image and then say, what is the caption of the image? Then go back to the text and see what is said in the result section. No, don't do that. They should be standalone entities, meaning they should be self-explanatory. Once I see the figure, I should quickly understand the entire thing. Once I see the table, I should quickly understand what the author is trying to convey. I mean, I'm not saying the whole story, but at least what that table is trying to convey, the whole story about what that table is trying to convey, and the whole story about what that image is trying to convey, and not the partial story. Okay. So then figures should never duplicate already presented information. For example, see, some people, what they do is they say that I measured the output of the device as a function of time, and I saw that there was no measurable output. And then they present a graph saying that there was no output, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and they show nice graph. That's a waste of time, because you have already mentioned it, there was no output. Then why unnecessarily duplicate it and say that, he's a figure showing that there was no output? No, just say that there was no output. Bracket you can say in the bracket, you can say data not shown. Or you keep the data with you, you keep the raw data with you. If you want, you can include it in the supplementary section, but don't include it in your main paper. And that is one kind of duplication, unnecessary duplication. Other kind of duplication is when something is very simple and you can just say it in a line in your result section, and unnecessarily you're making a figure out of it. That also should be avoided. Now you have to include the appropriate scale bars and error bars. Many manuscripts, when they send back to the authors, they're sent back to the authors. One very common suggestion made by reviewers is include the error bars. See, whenever you do an experiment, you don't do an experiment once, right? You do it 3 times or 4 times, whatever, the numbers could vary. But when you do an experiment so many times, you don't get the same result every time, right? There is always some fluctuation. So then that fluctuation gives rise to a mean and a standard deviation. You know, there are many numbers that are generated. So you have to understand all these things. And you know, once you present your data will always have error bars. Make sure you include those error bars. You have to avoid overcrowding your plots and make sure the text in your graph is not so tiny that nobody can read it. Once I was sitting in a PhD seminar, I was going through the thesis, and the printed thesis, I looked at the font size of the it was so tiny that even with my specs and after borrowing a lens, I could not see what the images were trying to convey. That's why you have to make sure that your text size font is of legible size. All right. Now you also have to label your axes and identify the associated units. Include units in the first row of the table. Many people, what they do is they constantly keep on mentioning the unit inside the table all the time. Don't do it. Just label, just mention it once at the top. That's it. Don't mention it again. Now, very important tip, very important tip. Tables present specific values, whereas graphs present trends. This is a very important difference. Okay. Now let's go to the next slide. Okay, now let me quickly ask everyone, am I still audible and are my slides visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Nikhil madam. So let me continue slide number 19, figures and tables. Now you have to check your journal guidelines once again, and you have to basically see how the journal wants you to prepare your figures and tables. Then there could be certain requirements, like the journal may ask you to submit figures that are of sufficiently high resolution, like 600 dpi. Then you don't want to submit an image that is 100 dpi, you know, something on those lines. Then very important thing, a low resolution image cannot be magically converted into a high resolution image. Many times what happens is when you do the experiment, you generate some image and then it is generated by the machine, and unfortunately you got a low resolution image because you forgot to change the settings. Then no person in the world can can legitimately convert a low resolution image into a high resolution image, you know, without introducing artifacts. So that's something you should never do. If the journal wants high resolution image, make sure from day one, make sure your machine, your instrument generates high resolution output. Whatever, let's say if you're working with a conf that you save, they should be of sufficiently high resolution. Retain all copies of your images, files, metadata, everything. You never know. Nowadays, journals sometimes they ask authors to submit the raw data to cross-check for data fabrication and image manipulation. Let's move on to the results section. So as soon as you are done with your...
Sir, can I interrupt you for a minute, sir?
Okay,
Nirmala ma'am, can you switch off your unmute your speaker, ma'am? Nirmala ma'am, can you unmute? Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Now you can continue, sir.
All right, no problem. All right, so once you finish your figures and tables, you should immediately start working on your results section. Now, a word of caution here. If you simply state what you found during your study, that's exactly what you should do. That's perfectly fine. But you should never interpret the results. You should never discuss the implications, or you should never conclude anything. So results section is very clear. You just have to tell people what you found during your study. Whenever you did the set of experiments, what did you find? Why did you find? That's it. Just share the numbers. That's it. Don't analyze the numbers. Don't draw any conclusions. Don't discuss anything else. Don't try to interpret. Just share your data. Just share your numbers. That's all you need to do in the results section. Now, sometimes some journals have a common section and they title it as results and discussion. In that case, what you can do is in the beginning of the section, towards the beginning, you can just share the numbers, and towards the end, you can interpret or analyze those numbers. But if the sections are different, then in the result section only showcase your results, and in the discussion section only interpret or analyze those results. All right, then next point, you have to use the right subheadings. I'll not stress on things that are obvious. You can just go through those. You have to summarize, what the reader should expect to find in the table. Now, do not say the same thing, whatever you have said in the table, again in the text. In the text, just say what you expect them to find, and let them go and read the table. Say as shown in that table, and let the reader find, discover. Statistical tests, you include all the relevant parameters, mean, standard deviation. Now, do not choose results that best serve your objectives. That is very unethical. You have to share all kinds of results that you get. Even if you get an odd result, you have to say that, see, this is one odd result that we got. And you should get it consistently. We have been consistently getting this odd result. And then we don't know the reason, but it is worth investigating. You never know. Somebody who reads your paper may in fact get a new idea and may in fact publish a paper in Cell Science or Nature, just because he or she saw that odd result that you were getting. You could not probably work on it because of some limitations, but the person may pick it up from there and publish it somewhere. That's how you contribute to the advancement of your field. And that's why you should share all kinds of result. Now, one very funny thing here, sometimes what happens is you get some strange result because something really weird has been happening. Like, for example, when one of my friends was working on a microscope, and he was getting something on his microscope, and he was not able to find the source. Suddenly he realized that somebody on the upper floor, they were moving their gas cylinders, and because of that some kind of noise was being generated, which was artificially generating some data in his machine. Something happened, nobody knows how it happened, but that's not the kind of result I'm talking about. That's a kind of a silly thing. So you have to, when you do your experiment, you have to pay attention to the environment. Is the ambient temperature okay? Is the is there a huge variation in the temperature? Is it like the humidity? Is it differing a lot? All those things matter a lot. And if you need controlled conditions, you have to move your setup to a place that has controlled conditions. Like some laboratories, they have very strict control on the temperature and those kind of things. So that's what I'm trying to say. There's a difference between an odd result and a bizarre result. Bizarre result is when something weird happens and you have to redesign your experiment. Odd result is when you are doing everything in the right way, but you don't know why that odd result is showing up. Now, some very common mistakes. Now let's go through this some of the common mistakes very quickly. Not using the right unit symbols. In the first case, measured output was 100 kilowatt. What is wrong here? The K is capital. It is Kelvin watt. It's not kilowatt. So you have to use a lowercase k, kilowatt. Then spelling the unit, like don't say 1 meter, just say 1 m. Then 1.6 kilojoule. There is no space between 1.6 and kilojoule. So you have to insert the space. So these are tiny things, but these are nevertheless very important. You can go through the slides. I'll not spend a lot of time on these. You can go through the slides later on. Now, as soon as you finish the result section, you should immediately start working on your discussion section. You have to explain what your data mean to your target audience, and use simple language. Don't use flowery, complicated language full of adjectives and very complicated long sentences. Sometimes people think that just to prove to the world that I am a great researcher, I have to use long sentences. That's not true at all. You can use very simple language. Let your data be powerful. Don't make your language powerful. Language should be simple. Let your analysis be powerful. Let your data be powerful. Let your research problem be powerful. Let your interpretation be powerful. Let your language be simple. So in the discussion section, you have to explain what your data means. You have to analyze your data. You have to interpret your data for your target audience, and you have to do it in very easy language, simple language. Now, do not suddenly introduce new concepts like suddenly I am seeing some analyzing results and I start discussing something totally different. Then people will say, oh my God, what is this? I have no idea where this is leading. And they'll not take you seriously. So don't introduce new items suddenly. Now you have to, just like I said, you have to highlight and never ignore unusual, unexpected results. Then do your results support your original hypothesis? How? You have to discuss this nicely. Now, second last point, are there any limitations? Every study has limitations. So you have to be upfront, you have to be honest, you have to be diligent, and you have to communicate these limitations to your target audience so that people understand that you are being legitimate and honest. And in fact, somebody can start from that point and they can lead to the advancement of the field. So you have to honestly highlight the limitations as well. I have yet to see a study that has no limitations. See, every single thing that we do on this planet, including academic publishing, whatever we do, everything has limitations. I have yet to see a process that has no limitations. That such a process does not exist. In nature, there is nothing called 100%. It can be 99.999999999%, but it will never be 100%. So you have to, whatever the tiny limitations are, tiny limitations, massive limitations, you have to highlight them. Last point, very important, never over interpret your results or never misinterpret your results. Now, very common error that happens here, presenting the results one more time. That's not what you do in the discussion section. Merely restating your results, just rephrasing the results is not what you do in the discussion section. There's a clear difference. Results section, you only present your numbers, you present your data, and discussion section, you interpret the data. And one more common mistake, not analyzing your results thoroughly. Now, conclusion. In some journals, this is a separate section. In many journals, it is the last paragraph of the discussion section. Check with your target journal. Check what their journal guidelines say. Now, here's a word of caution. Never repeat what you said in the results and discussion section. This is a very common error. So basically, what should you do here? In this section, you should show how your work adds value to the existing literature and how it contributes to the advancement of the field. You have to say that so far XYZ, Jacobson and co-workers showed this, and Smith showed that, and Henry showed this, and all these people, somebody from Stanford showed that, somebody from Harvard showed this. However, our lab showed this, and this is something very genuine, and this is very different, and this is how it's going to lead to the advancement of the field. Because this fantastic medicine, companies can start manufacturing the medicine because of my work, something on those lines. This is what you have to say in the conclusion section. How is discussion different from the conclusion? In the discussion section, you interpret your results without saying too much about what is its significance to society. You reserve that for the conclusion section. And again, like I said, sometimes there is no separate conclusion section. If it could be a part of the discussion section, but then it's at the towards the end of the discussion section. So I'm sure you get my point now. Avoid repeating what you're about to say in your abstract. Many times what people do is conclusion, they make it as same as abstract. No, abstract basically presents something completely different, and I'll tell you what it shows a few slides later. Were you able to address the research problem identified in your introduction? What are the implications and applications of your work? Are there any benefits? Now, last point is very important. Are further experiments necessary? Are they already underway? You have to discuss all of these things in the conclusion section. I don't have to overemphasize. All of you are smart people, so you can refer to these slides and you can do it accordingly. I'm sure I've taken enough time to explain these things. Now, introduction section is something that you have to write after the conclusion, towards the end of your manuscript drafting process. It should be concise, to the point. It should not look like a transcript of a very boring history lecture. Like Jacobson did this, then Smith did that, and Dr. Williams did this, and somebody else did that, and then it's like so boring and massive that people they run out of patience and they say, okay, I'm not going to read this article. Don't do that. You have to basically be to the point. XYZ did this, they did that, and then don't cite unnecessary articles just to increase your number of citations in your reference list. Don't do that. The reviewers dislike this approach. They in fact don't like it. Then you have to discuss what problem are you trying to address. Did you identify the research gap? And if yes, I'm definitely yes, because that's why you're writing the manuscript. How do you plan to address it? That's what you have to say here. What is your hypothesis? That's what you have to say here. Are there any controversies in your field? In many fields, there are controversies. I have yet to see a field where there are no controversies. Most of the fields, or probably all of the fields, always have controversies. But then you should not take sides. If there is a controversy, you have to say person A said this, person B said that, person C said this. This is, you have to give the entire picture. Don't partially present or present selectively or present in such a way so as to serve your purpose. Present all the sides. Let the people decide. You never show bias. This is how you should write the introduction section. Save these slides carefully. You can refer to all of my slides once I'm done with the presentation. I'm sure they are going to record it. They're already recording it. So you can go back and check these very important points. Also go through the list of references that I'll be sharing towards the end. Now let's go to the abstract section. We are approaching the end of the presentation, so I thank you for bearing with me. In a few minutes, we'll quickly finish, summarize, and then you can share your questions with me. I'll give you time. Now, abstract. Basically, you start with a smart literature review in about 1 or 2 sentences. That's it. That's it, done. Then you have to immediately say, what did you do? Why did you do it? What did you find? Why are your findings so critically important? And then here, what you have to do is you have to be very concise. You have to pay attention to the word count. And you have to be very brief. Brief, to the point, concise, smart. Abstract is a very smart summary, but you have to do it in this manner. And a good abstract is always informative, but it's never excessively detailed. And it grabs the attention of your target audience. It has to be like an advertisement, you know. It is a slightly bigger version of your advertisement. What is the top advertisement? Is the title. Then the title, you advertise your work with your title, but you advertise your work also with your abstract. And then of course you have to use the right keywords, because your work has to be indexed by search engines. We'll come to that soon. Structured abstracts also exist, and your target journal will tell you how to write those, so you can go through the journal guidelines. Now, next important point is title. Title should reflect the essence, the summary of your title, its novelty. And journal editors don't like titles that don't make sense or fail to communicate the core of your manuscript effectively. Now, let's see a few examples, because merely saying these things doesn't help. Now, let's see 3 examples. First example, what was the title? Impact of process parameters on the uniformity of silver alloys. Some of you could be from this particular field. Even if you're not, doesn't matter. Yeah, I'm sure you'll understand. Now, the first title was very vague. Impact of process parameters. Which process parameter? I don't know which parameters. So then the second title is slightly better. Impact of temperature and pressure. So the process parameters have been defined. On the what uniformity? Compositional uniformity of silver alloys. Now, what kind of silver alloys? Any random silver alloy, or silver alloys that are of a particular type. In this case, they are sputter deposited silver alloys. But then the person did simulation studies. So the last, the third bullet point was the final title. impact of temperature and pressure on the simulated compositional uniformity of sputter deposited silver alloy. So see, all the main things are there, and it nicely presents it in a very nice flow, and it attracts the attention. This is how you should write your title. Keywords are important because they make your article more searchable. Everybody knows it. If you even post a video to YouTube, unless you use the right keywords, nobody is going to find your video. So you have to have the right metadata. You have to have the right keywords. You have to avoid words with general meaning. The keywords have to be specific to your field, and they should do justice to your content. Let's see a few examples. Now, when will your article get nicely indexed? I'm only 5 slides away from the end of this presentation, so just bear with me for a few minutes. Manuscript title was Direct Observation of Nonlinear Optics in an Isolated Carbon Nanotube. So what is a very poor choice of keywords? Molecule, optics, lasers, energy lifetime, very general keywords. You have to use something that is specific to your field or subfield. So what would that be? So better choice of keywords would be single molecule interaction, Kerr effect, carbon nanotubes, energy level structure. Now, these keywords keep changing from field to field. So whatever is your niche, whatever is your area of expertise, you have to choose the keywords, optimal keywords based on that. Authorships and acknowledgement, people who have contributed to manuscript, but not to the extent that that would justify authorship. You can always acknowledge them. Like for example, somebody did proofreading, somebody edited your manuscript. That's okay. You can acknowledge. You don't have to give authorship to that person. Now, here's where things get a little bit tricky. Are you collaborating with someone? Then when you establish the collaboration, you have to assign the authorship based on the extent of contribution. When you have those meetings, initial first few meetings, you have to discuss who is going to do what. Then once you do that, you'll immediately understand. Once you know who is going to do what, you know who's going to contribute the most. But having said that, things may change actually. A person A may be contributing a lot in the beginning, but suddenly what happens is that the research group takes over, and somebody from there starts getting really fantastic results. So in that case, that person could be the first author. So, those things are dynamic. No doubt they're dynamic, but at least in the beginning, you should have some little bit of an idea about who is going to be the first author and second author and, corresponding author, so forth and so on. Make sure you acknowledge your funding agency and make sure you include the grant number. Now, is anything missing? When you finish writing all these sections, you have to see, you have to cross check. Now you have to go and take a walk in the garden. Now, why do you need to do this? Because if you sit at one time at one place for a long time, you get bored, and then your brain, the efficiency of your brain starts decreasing, and then you may easily miss a few things here and there. So if you don't want that to happen, you actually go out for a walk. Make sure you wear your mask, okay? Because there's this coronavirus outside. So practice social distancing, wear a mask, go for a walk, come back, and then check your manuscript. Then you will see that you'll spot some mistakes, you'll spot some errors, and go ahead and check those, correct those errors. And why do you need to do this? Because missing items can be easily spotted only when you have a fresh mind. And you don't have to go outside. You can listen to music, eat some healthy food, exercise. You do whatever things you are interested in, whatever non-academic things you are interested in, and then come back and check your manuscript. This is a very important tip because many people forget to do this, but this is very important. And for the aforementioned reasons. Now, how to avoid rejections? Now, why do reviewers reject manuscripts? Because journal editors many times ask them to respond to questions such as, does the manuscript address an interesting problem? If it's not addressing an interesting problem, the reviewers can reject it, the editor can, and then the editor can reject it. Do you see a novel approach? Is the manuscript well structured? How about the language? Is it flawless? Does the method section ensure that other people can reproduce your data, your experiments? Are you providing adequate results? And have you analyzed those results meaningfully in your discussion section? Are the conclusions supported? Whatever you're saying in the conclusion, you're saying that you're contributing to the advancement of your field. Really, does it significantly make a difference? Is somebody be able to make medicines based on your synthetic organic chemistry? You know, whatever you have said there, is it really supported by the obtained data? Are the figures and tables sufficient? Are they nicely designed? Are they non-redundant? Are the inserted references adequate? Are they recent? All of these things, you know, those reviewers, I have myself reviewed manuscripts. So, you know, many times editors ask reviewers to to answer a questionnaire, fill in a questionnaire. So make it really easy for them. If they see that you are not complying with one or all of the above, they'll instantly reject your manuscript. So this is how you avoid rejection. I'm not saying that mere compliance with these will guarantee acceptance, but what I'm saying is that compliance with these will increase your odds of journal acceptance, will increase the odds of journal acceptance. Now, very last point is how to draft a good cover letter. You need to market. Now, many researchers are not good in marketing their story. Now, you know, I have done a lot of digital marketing, so I know where people are surprised. Actually, I have got a PhD in biochemistry, but I'm very active in the field of communication and marketing. I don't have an MBA. I don't have a, you know, any of those degrees, but still I am able to do it. And that's because, you know why? Because a PhD teaches you how to observe things very carefully. And that's why I feel confident today that based on my PhD experience, I can, in fact, work in a lot of areas. And you know how I got into digital marketing? Because I was working at a technical communications firm. It was a multinational company in Mumbai. And that's where I learned this. And you know, researchers who have an open mindset and a desire to learn can learn a lot of things. It doesn't have to be from your field. It can be from any other field. Doesn't matter. I know a scientist who is doing the work of an engineer. He's my friend. His name is John Rafter. I can openly tell his name. And I also know a few engineers who are working in the area of science. So don't compartmentalize yourself. You can work in any area. You should just have the will to learn. You can do anything. Absolutely. So you need to market your story to the editor-in-chief. The manuscript title and article type should be mentioned. What problem is being addressed needs to be mentioned. You have to say, without exaggerating, you have to say something about the novelty and implications of your study. Now, you don't have to say that this is a landmark study published by Dr. Gokhale. And, you know, Dr. Gokhale is so great that, you know, very fantastic study, very, very insightful. You don't have to say that. Never say this. Avoid flowery language. Don't exaggerate. Just say that it's a new finding. It's an interesting finding, and leave the rest to the editor. Let the person decide. So then, final point: tell the editor-in-chief that you are not submitting the manuscript elsewhere, and that all the authors have read and approved it. Okay, so I think with that we come to the end of today's session. These are the references. I'm sure because this session is being recorded, you'll be able to go back and check this slide, and you'll be able to access the links from there. You can access my slides as well. Now let's open up the session for questions. So I wish you all the best for your entire publication process. Have a wonderful publication journey. And before we end the session, let's have a few questions. Now, what would be the best way to answer questions? Is it through microphone or through chat?
Sir, they can drop a message and they can also unmute themselves and speak, sir.
Okay, but let's do it this way. If somebody wants to unmute, let one person do it at a time so that everybody doesn't speak at the same time.
Yes, sir. They will share. They will raise their hand and then they can ask the question, sir.
Perfect. That's a very good
sir,
idea.
you have to stop sharing your screen, sir.
Okay, okay. Let me stop there. Let me quickly share the last screen. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nikat madam, and thank you, B.S. Abdur Rahman, Crescent Institute of Science and Technology, for this warm invitation. Thanks to AIC